Hello everybody, my name is Jarko Vukovic. I'm the founder of PolyAPI, and in this video I just wanted to take some time and dig a little bit deeper into training Poly. This is a topic that is a little bit hard to conceive, which causes people to sometimes imagine different things, and I get a lot of questions around, well, could you just look at my gateway traffic? Could you look at my OpenAPI specifications? Could you look at my code repository to train Poly? And so I wanted to just do a deep dive to showcase kind of how exactly Poly is trained, and then also narrate why we made certain decisions. So the first thing I want to just kind of orient you guys, I'm in Postman here, and I have a collection that uses a mock service. I use the mock service for this demo just because it gives me full control over the exact responses, and I can keep it very, specific and pointed, and use examples that illustrate the concepts really clearly. And we're going to go ahead and train Poly on a number of these different API endpoints. So the first one we're going to start with is just an endpoint to get a set of birds, right? And here we can see that the only variable it's expecting is a token. Everything else is hard-coded. So when I make this call here, what ends up happening is Poly basically observes both the traffic, the request and the response, but also it sees my Postman configuration. And so it looks for Postman variables to decide what it should make as arguments. And this is a concept that really lent itself very nicely because, in Postman you can decorate just the pieces that you want to be dynamic. And so we just ride on top of that concept to make it so that you can, basically designate to Poly what elements of the request should be treated as arguments. And then what happens is if Poly gets a successful response, it builds an object model for the response type. And we'll take a look here in the console and see that, we got a 200 from the Birds API, but also a 201 from Poly. And so now I could actually go to my Poly instance and take a look at what was created for me. So we could see that this call here is, the AI classified it as Postman Birds, which, it's taken a best effort, and in this case it's a kind of a silly mock. So, it did okay, and it gave me a get. So it gets birds from Postman, which is actually technically correct. It also wrote a description that says, this API call retrieves a list of birds from the Postman database. Okay, a little bit inaccurate, but again, it's a mock service from Postman, so I guess technically correct. Each bird object includes details such as ID, name, scientific name, lifespan, height, etc., features, and diet. So really a good description actually of what that API endpoint was. And like I mentioned, all that was generated by the AI behind the scenes. Now, if I look at the details of it, we can see that we can also see the arguments. And in this case, there's only one argument, like I mentioned, called token, which is a string. And, it's not part of the payload. It is required. And, the secure field is something that we haven't leveraged the AI to determine yet. But, in an ideal world, it would say yes, because it's an authorization header. It looks like it should be secure. So that's the training. So now if I go to VS Code, I can see that we have our library tree, which is an explorer of what's there. So it should show up under P, so under Postman. So when I rebuild my client library, we'll see it show up there. Now, I could also ask the AI assistant to help me find it, understand its payload, etc. I could do something like, how do I get a list of birds and print out their diets? So hopefully this will go off, find that API, understand the response object model from the training, and I'll be able to give us a very kind of detailed example on how we specifically access the diets of these birds out of that object model. In the meantime, we'll see that we do now have a Postman section, and then inside it, oh, actually that's the wrong one, sorry, PSTMAN, that's the one it picked. We got birds and we got get, and I could import Poly from PolyAPI. Actually, it looks like this guy wrote the example for me quicker, so I don't know, I just go ahead and copy it, paste it. No TypeScript errors. I'm actually not even going to read it. I'm just going to run it because that's kind of not the point of this demo. But we'll hopefully get some, diets of birds. So really, again, amazing. Like, I know I'm the creator of this product and I get super hyped on it, but like that, from just watching one Postman call to be able to give me this experience, I think is personally fantastic. Now, if we go back to the next call, so in the next call, I wanted to basically showcase a case where I hard-coded a particular query parameter. So in this case here, it's still just a token, but I'm changing the URL. So now what's going to happen if I make this call, we have to default to some behavior and then give the developer overrides, the trainer overrides. So here we said, you know what, this looks like a retraining of that same function. It's the same interface, it's the same response object. The only difference is that there's some additional query parameters. So I could just call it and it would do a retrain, but I could also add an element in the pre-request script, which I'm just going to go ahead and pluck from my pre-request script here at the collection level, where I can specify that I actually want this function to be trained as a new function. So I'll drop this in here, get rid of the stars, and this guy will actually train this function as a new function. So I'll go ahead and hit send. We'll see that we get the same object model. This time we don't get that first bird, which doesn't eat insects. And then if we look inside Poly, we should now see a new function because of that parameter that I passed for birds that eat insects. So now here, the AI took a best effort and said, okay, it's still Postman birds and it's get, but this time we're getting them by their diet. Now, really this should be, get the birds that eat insects. So here it kind of interpreted this as like being optional, right? Like something that the developer who uses this function can determine. And that's actually, in my opinion, a bug on Poly. Like we need to fix it so that the AI understands what is dynamic and what isn't. And we're going to do that in the near future. But for now, I'll use this as an opportunity to actually go ahead and override it and showcase the patching capability, where I can go ahead and say I want to patch this function, but actually first let me get its details to make the patching easier. And I have the ability to basically patch everything except the ID here. So I'm going to just go ahead and copy this whole object. I'm going to wrap it in curly brackets. And then here I can edit whatever I want. And you don't have to provide the whole payload. It's a patch endpoint, so you could provide just the pieces you're changing. So I'm still going to keep the arguments the same. I'm going to go ahead and get birds that eat insects. So again, kind of a silly one, and I'm not going to bother with the description. You get the idea, but I'm going to go ahead and send this. And now we should have, oh, I did a get again. Now we should have basically, let's see, argument 0 not bound. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and drop this. I don't think you can actually just pass the arguments as is. They require a slightly different structure, which is in our OpenAPI specification, but you can see that now we have a function which gets birds that eat insects. And so in my code here, I'm just going to switch this to get, I'm going to actually regenerate it. And keep in mind in this here, it was the American robin was the first one. And notice this one doesn't eat insects. So we'll keep the code exactly the same. We'll just rebuild our client library to get that new function, and we'll see it show up here on the left in the tree view. There it is. And then I'm just going to go ahead and edit the code directly. And we can see that now we have this other function, which is get birds that eat insects. I'll select that, save it, run it again. And this time we shouldn't see that first. We should just see the blue jay that eats insects and then the northern cardinal, which also eats insects. So that shows you how you can have kind of tailored specific functions. Again, both of these functions are built off the same API, and hence the name, where basically Poly gives you a polymorphic interface to your APIs, and it could actually be one or more APIs behind the scenes that are powering a single function. And you can have many functions powered by the same API. Now, what if we don't want just birds that eat insects? What if we want to be able to filter birds that based on what they eat? So in this case here, I have another function ready to go, where in this case, it's actually dynamic. And this title is actually a little bit wrong, really, just to not confuse anyone. This is kind of like, a dynamic way of doing it, where you hard code that you want to filter by the diet. You make the diet something that people should pass in. So you want them to take an explicit decision on it by making the diet a required field, but you don't actually care which diet they eat. So you can find, whatever birds you want. So I'm going to go ahead and hit send here. Okay, make sure everything's good. So I'll hit send. And you can see that, again, it's the same exact response, but we should see a new function within Poly because we now have two Postman variables. And so the default behavior of Poly is that if it sees a different set of variables, it treats that as a new training of a new function. Again, you can override that. We just have to make some defaults. So now this one is actually aptly named. So this is get birds, get by diet. It's used to retrieve information about birds, and then basically, so you can do that. And then I can basically go ahead and get the details of it. And this time we should see two parameters. So we see diet, which is a string, and a token, which is a string. So again, really a lot of flexibility. Now, if you want to go take it one step further, and let's say I want to actually change it so that instead of diet, maybe we have a whole collection of query parameters, and I just want to let people pass in whatever query parameters they want. So I'm going to take the same function ID, because in this case, I'm going to show you how to explicitly retrain a function. And this one, again, a little typo in my name. So this is really kind of an open-ended query parameters approach, where I'm going to actually retrain that function that I just showed you. But instead of an explicit query parameter as an argument, I'm going to make query parameters the whole string as an argument. So that means that now with this approach, people can pass in whatever query parameters they want as a string. So you can tell we're kind of getting looser and looser. And as you get looser, you're basically putting the onus on your consumers to have to kind of better understand the API. So we'll go ahead and hit send here. We should get the same response because, again, query params is set to diet equals insects. And then if we look at our function now, same function, I'm just going to refresh. It's still get by diet because it doesn't rename it. That's fine. That's, again, a decision. We didn't want the names and classifications changing for retraining. But you can see now that the argument did change, and now it expects query parameters. So I'm going to leave the name as is. I'm just going to go ahead and show you now inside VS Code that if we refresh the client library, we should have yet another function. And this function should allow me to pass in query parameters as a string. So I'm going to go ahead and just change this one here to get by diet. And it's going to complain because this thing's expecting two arguments. And it's actually expecting the token second, and it's expecting the query parameters first. And it's just expecting a string for query parameters, so I'll say diet equals, I think it's plural, hit save, run it, and we should see this same result, so that's actually expected. But with this approach, you can basically append additional query params and write whatever you want as a way to be really flexible. Now, you could get really loose if you wanted, and this is, I don't advise you to do this, but just as a kind of a thought exercise, you could set the host as a parameter, the path as a parameter, the query params as a parameters. You can make the headers, and the body, and you would have effectively a function that can call any function, but Poly hasn't done really anything for you because it's not going to be able to build an object model. It's just going to treat it as any on the return type. And so you'll end up with a generic function you can use to call whatever API you want, effectively having, Axios minus some of the other benefits of it. So I don't advise against this, but just as a conceptual, I don't advise you to do this, but as a conceptual thought process, I wanted to show you this as an option. Now, let's go one step further. In this case here, we're going to do token, and we're getting the details of a particular bird. So I'll go ahead and hit send. We have the ID here. That's it. It gets the ID of it. And now we should have another function. If I refresh it, it gets the ID of a single bird. And we can see that, that's going to show up here. I won't invoke this one. It's exactly the same concept. But just wanted to show you kind of training a function that lives at a different resource. It's going to go ahead and create a new function for us here. And we'll see it again under birds, get details. And this one expects an ID, which is a number, and a token, which is a string. Now, I do want to point out that we do take a best guess as to what the object is. Now, let's say this is actually a mistake. Let's say that coincidentally, this was just a 1, but it could be an A, a B, a C. And so you as a trainer want to correct this. So to change the object type, you could just go to the functions, and I'll show you guys how to do that. You can basically grab the function, go to its details, and then find the argument you want to change and find its key. So in this case, I want to change ID, and I want to change its type from number to string, just as an example. So in the payload, to actually patch it, you would say arguments, and then you would go curly brackets, and then you'd use the ID of the argument. So in this case, the key of the argument, which is in this case is ID. And then in here, I would go ahead and specify that I want to change type. Oops. And I want to change the type from a number to a string. So I would say I want it to be a string, and hit save. Make this a patch, fire it off, and we can see that now the ID is a string, such that if I actually hover over this guy, you can see it kind of behind me here. ID number. Let me see if I can hover over it. A little hard. Okay, I'm not going to be able to get it. I'll just paste it in here so you guys can see it. So it expects an ID, which is a number, and a token, which is a string. And then when I regenerate my client library, we should see that change to a string and a string. Okay. And on the next hover, you can see now it's a string. So again, showcasing that you have full control over correcting anything that either Poly kind of programmatically got wrong, or the AI didn't assign the way that you like it. Cool. So now let's go to the next example. So here I want to show a post, actually a couple of posts. So the first post call, I'm not going to fire because it doesn't make any sense, but I just wanted to kind of explain it. If I train this function, I would get a function which expects a token, and it would always create the same bird with the same information. So it has, like, unlike a get, which receives, maybe a collection that you don't need to specify, the details, you'll just get the collection at the time it is. With puts and posts, it doesn't make any sense to train it to always produce the same thing. Now, maybe there's some kind of like static event that you want to fire off to somewhere, and you want to use this as like a trigger for it, and the event's always the same. So maybe there is some kind of use case where it makes sense, but generally for like dealing with resources, this does not make sense. Now, what I did in the next call here is I created just Postman variables for each of these, and I enumerated them separately. So here, if I go ahead and fire this off, we should get a creation, and we should actually get a poly function which expects each of these things as an argument. Now, some of these are objects, some of them are strings, some of them are numbers, some of them are arrays of objects. So let's go take a look and see what Poly actually interpreted in that call. So if I go here and refresh it, so create birds, wonderful, that's a good name. And then if we go in there and look at the details, we could see the token is a string, the name is a string, the scientific name is a string, so max age is a number, so far so good. Height is a number, weight was a number, comma separated colors is a string, beak color was a string, wing characteristics. Now this one's an object, and you can actually see it has the type schema defined here. So it actually builds out the schema. It's a little bit hard to read with these escape characters, but nonetheless, it actually understood that there is a type of wing characteristic, which is a string, and then there's a definition, which is a string. And I think that was right. Let me just double check to see if I can cross correlate that. So I think that was wings. Let me see, wings or insects type. What was that? That was under wing characteristics. Yeah, we'll see how it plays out. Oh, actually, sorry, I'm just misreading this. What it's saying is that there's a string and a comma, and then there's another string. So there's just two strings in this array of items. And then the other one here, the diet list, a little bit more complicated. This one is actually an array of objects. As we could see, I'll switch back to it in just a second, but I'm not going to try and parse this here. You can basically see that, it built out the schema for you. So what I'll go ahead and do now is I'll go ahead and, I do want to point out actually one more thing real quick, is that I did rename some of these. So you'll notice, for example, lifespan here, but I wrote it as max age. For, color, which actually was a comma separated list of colors, I made a comma separated list of colors. So you have the ability to name these arguments something more friendly than what you're inheriting with the API that you're training. And that gives you a lot of flexibility to kind of map the language to something more appropriate for your industry or your company, instead of just using it as is out of the box with the vendor's API. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and showcase that function now inside VS Code. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I'll ask our friendly assistant, how do I create a new bird? And we'll have it do that. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and just regenerate my client library to have that latest function. And we should see a bird's create pop up here. Okay, there it is. Okay, so we could see that it generated this for us here. Again, leveraging OpenAI, it came up with the scientific name, and it actually has the right age and height and weight. It's just amazing. Like try sitting here and coming up with this example on your own. Like you just get stuck for like 10 minutes for no reason. So we'll save it. We'll see that again compiles right out of the gate. Looks okay. And we'll notice here a couple things. So one thing is that it took a set of these arguments and put them in the payload. And we do this automatically when there's too many arguments. I think it's like 5. We feel that your function is going to look kind of bad if it wraps off to the right or potentially wraps to a new line. It's just really hard to parse. So in the case that we have more than 5 arguments, I think, we create this new object called payload, and we put all the payload elements inside that one. So you could see that here, it came up with this. And again, I'm just super impressed because you could see that, it eats fruits at 50% and nuts at 20%. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is actually pretty accurate. So I get a smile every time I see it do stuff like this, because this is the kind of stuff that's just total waste of time if you're sitting there doing it yourself. So let's run this one. We should hopefully get just a 201 saying it was created. I don't actually log anything, so let me just wrap this real quick. I could ask it to do that, but I'll just do it real quick. Con equals an async function. Okay, and then we'll put the invocation in there. We'll make it const response. Or actually, you know what? I'll just do this. Console.log await, and then we'll paste that, and we'll invoke main. Hit save, run it again, and hopefully we'll get an array. So this time I got a 400. Request body has an invalid format. I'm gonna spare you the trouble of me figuring out what's going on here, and I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Basically, little bug in Poly. I'll spare you the details. It'll be fixed probably within the next 24 hours. So anyways, we got that 400. I did a quick workaround in Postman to address it, but now we're getting a 200. And one thing you'll notice is this is supposed to be a parrot, but I'm getting back a cardinal. Again, I'm working with a mock service here for this example, but you could see that, it's got the full understanding of it. And then we could also see that inside the console, you have that full object model, and I've shown this in other videos, but just to showcase it quickly here. So yeah, and then lastly, I just want to showcase one more quick thing. The birds generic, you have the ability to basically, again, because Postman allows you to really use objects and environment variables for whatever you want. So you can technically make it so that the whole payload is just an argument, and you tell the developer, hey, pass in the payload, and it is going to build the schema to understand what that payload should look like. And then, that could be an approach too. So I'll go ahead and fire this off real quick. I do want to, paste in the script to treat it as actually, you know what? It'll treat it as a new function anyways, because the arguments are different. So same exact call, except this time the payload is just kind of the whole payload rather than those enumerated fields. You lose the ability to obviously name the fields which you want, etc. This is just a straight pass through of what the backend API wants. So I'll go down here and see we got a 201. Great. We'll rebuild this one more time. And then we'll see, create one, or I wonder what it's going to name it. Create one, there it is. And then if we look at what create one looks like, we could see that here it just expects the bird object. And then the bird object is going to be basically its own model. So it doesn't enumerate it here, but I think we can go to the type definition here and take a look at it, or actually just go to the definition of the function. And we could see here that it expects, let's see, where are we? Create one. And it's got the birds create one return, or sorry, the bird object argument. And we can go to this guy and see what a bird object expects. And so you can see it's got the, the name, scientific, lifespan, size, features, diet, height, beak, but it's so it builds the object for you, which is actually, again, really impressive because it saves you a ton of time. But you did lose the ability to kind of transform it the way you want it. So it is, pros and cons, but this might actually make sense for a lot of people just to get going quickly with Poly. So hopefully this deep dive was helpful in easing some fears or tensions of training Poly. It's really not that difficult. You just have to use the API, and you just have to have an opinion on kind of how it should be presented to a developer inside VS Code. You can be as narrow and specific as you want. You can be as broad as you want. So that's maybe one of those things that is a little bit scary till you kind of get the hang of it. But once you get the hang of it, you start to realize how much power you have to create functions off of a single API, and how much being specific with your naming and your variables just really, really, really simplifies the consumption of the API for certain use cases. And so, that's where Poly really shines, is when you have a particular use case and you want to create a simple function to use it, but you could also be more broad and take advantage of, saving the developer a lot of time by doing things like I did here with, the whole payload being an argument. So anyways, thank you for watching this video. I know it was a little longer than normal, but I really wanted to do this deep dive to help the community out. Thanks so much. Have a great day.